Hello and welcome back to the Classics Podcast Does Virgil's Aeneid with myself, Katrina Kelly.
And me, Caroline Lawrence.
Thank you so much for joining us again and for liking and subscribing to the podcast. You really are fantastic. Thank you so much. This is the podcast where we take inspiration from a word of Virgil's ancient epic poem that helps us dive into his literary world, his characters, his imagery and similes, his exquisite verse. And this week, our word is actually one of the hardest Latin words to translate in a way, simple though it first appears. Caroline, what is our word of the week?
Our word of the day or the week or the podcast is Pius. It's an adjective, so we probably don't need to decline it because there'd be millions of forms.
But it has close links to an abstract noun as well, pietas. That might be one that people are more familiar with. And we can decline that, can't we?
Well, yeah, and like many abstract nouns, that's a noun, a thing word that stands for something we can't really see, abstract. It's feminine. And the definition of pietas is dutiful conduct toward the gods, one's family, especially your father, and to your fatherland or your country. So how do we decline pietas, this abstract feminine noun?
So it goes pietas, pietas, pietatem, pietatis, pietati, pietati. Hard to distinguish, but one's with an I, one's with an E. And it doesn't really appear in the plural. It's more that abstract singular kind of noun. So we don't have to worry about that. But just a word on also when we decline these words, which we hope is just a bit of fun and it's useful if you're revising your Latin grammar. But we do it in the UK way, and I know that if you're in a different country, then sometimes the order in which that grammar is learnt and those things are declined, those cases, can be in a different order. So we go with the nominative, the vocative, the accusative comes next, then the genitive, dative, and ablative. And I know sometimes the accusative and the genitive are put in a different form. Which way did you learn when you were learning, Caroline?
Yeah, in America, we do it a bit differently, and I've forgotten. It's been so long ago, but I'm sure it was that way. But I'm now thoroughly initiated into the British system.
Oh, we love to hear it.
Yeah, great.
So in the Aeneid then, where do we see Pius?
Yes, Virgil, it's an epithet. An epithet. Now, an epithet given to Aeneas, an epithet's an adjective or an attribution that's often attached to the name of a famous hero or god or goddess.
Yeah, and we've said before, haven't we? It's one of those markers of oral poetry that they give the poet a little metrical breathing space when you're reciting the noun and the epithet. So this is what we see in Homer, and he's got epithets for his heroes. So Achilles, hero of the Iliad, is podasokos Achilleus, swift-footed. Hector is tamer of horses. The goddess Hera, this is a fun one because she is Boopis. And again, this is a really hard word to translate. It only really appears in this description. It literally means ox-eye, the eye of an ox, which kind of, is that a compliment? It's a bit of a weird one, but apparently it was a compliment and it implies sort of deep hazel eyes, maybe a sense of insight as well. But even objects can have epithets as well. So the most famous ones, rosy-fingered dawn, the wine-dark sea. Again, words that sound lovely, they sound quite poetic in English, but they're often hard to translate from the original Greek there because they only really appear in these particular pairings. We don't have much to compare them to. I mean, wine-dark isn't the colour of the sea, is it? So it's always a bit of a moot point as well about our understanding of these qualities, but they would certainly have been familiar and useful phrases for epic poets, and then something that Virgil is adapting, even though, as we say, he's not really reciting in the same way.
Yeah, and that makes me think we should do a whole episode on synesthesia, which is the mixing of the senses when you see color, you see smells and you hear colors. And Mark Bradley, a great scholar who writes about color in the ancient world, says that often they had emotional connotations. So the sea is quite dangerous and turbulent. And so it's, and when you get a bit dizzy when you drink wine, don't you? So it's got a kind of a link between the intoxicating wine and the sea. And I like to think of Hera, the cow-eyed Hera, kind of like puppy dog eyes, we say. She's got the big brown eyes with the long eyelashes. And cattle are really important in the ancient world, a thing we tend to forget. We could do a whole episode on cattle. Yeah. Anyway, back to epithets. Even today, people have epithets. And I was trying to think of a few. For example, the people's princess was Princess Diana. And this is maybe before your time, but for me, the Queen of Soul is Aretha Franklin, and
Of
the
course.
King of Rock was Elvis, and For your generation, I guess Queen Bey or Charlotte Church, who's the voice of an angel.
Yes. And a nice link there to some TV program that we'll be mentioning later on in the episode with Charlotte.
yeah.
So, what about Aeneas then? What are his epithets?
Okay, well, he appears with he has bit parts in the Iliad, and he gets actually, I counted 7 different epithets he gets. One is son of Anchises, counselor to the Trojan, great-hearted, great-minded, king of men, and just simply great, and lord of the Trojans. So those all have a sense of responsibility. He's a son, he's a counselor, he's a lord of his people. And it kind of indicates that even back then, the Greeks thought of him as religiously observant and devoted to his followers. So that's in Homer, a little taste of him in Homer.
Yeah, and they're all very positive adjectives, aren't they? They're quite good ones, but they're not outstanding. They're not the sort of really memorable, really specific. He's not the most developed character in Homer, is he?
And they're often applied to other heroes, so it's not unique to him, really. Yeah, except son of Anchises, obviously.
Yeah, the patronymic. Okay, so we come to Virgil. What about Aeneas in Virgil?
Okay, well, Virgil, again, is using Homer, but in a new way, but he does use these wonderful epithets. And one of the ones he calls Aeneas is natus dea, goddess born. And people often talk to him when they want to get something from him, goddess born, Pater, he's often called, and that's a super important word we're going to devote a whole podcast to. Magnanimous, which is the same, and it's essentially the Greek version of megalatros or megalatoros, big-hearted. But mainly he gets this epithet pius, Pius, which is why it's our word of the day. And of course, Pius Aeneas, it rhymes. But today, if you call someone pious, which is what you immediately think of, it's almost an insult. It kind of hints that they're like a religious goody two-shoes. But the meaning in Latin is subtly different. And it essentially has a threefold meaning of dutiful in 3 senses: being responsible to the gods, being responsible to your family, and being responsible to your fatherland, the state. So, in other words, all 3 of those involve putting others' needs before your own.
Yeah, and that's essentially the Aeneid's ethos in a nutshell, isn't it? And I suppose, arguably, Roman virtue. The word virtus is very closely linked to pietas and to having this trifold impact on God's family state. Those are the 3 things that are most important. And we even see that in the layout of Roman homes as well, don't we? Where the household gods are, where those public and private spaces are, how a family is bound together by the pater familias, the head of the household.
Yeah, it's so linked. Pietas is so linked with pater, which is why, spoiler alert, next week we're doing pater. So now remember I said pietas was a feminine abstract noun. And so I was kind of looking into that. And she was more than just an abstract noun. She actually became a goddess with her own small temple in Rome, as several other personified concepts like Fortuna, the goddess of good luck, or Spes, the goddess of hope. So her little temple in Rome, I think near the Temple of Marcellus, or the Theater of Marcellus, rather, although it had a few sites. Anyway, it was first built in the 2nd century BC by a rich man after his son saved him in a battle. So he's kind of like, oh, my son saved me, and I'm building a temple to Pietas. This is, again, duty to the family. And it was used. Aeneas isn't the first person who gets the epithet Pius. And we've all heard of the 2nd century emperor Antoninus Pius.
Mm-hmm.
But the epithet as a cognomen seems to have been first introduced in the late Republic, 2 centuries, even 3 centuries before Antoninus Pius.
And just remind us, what's the difference between a praenomen and a cognomen to the Romans?
Okay, well, a cognomen is often like a nickname. So you've got your praenomen, your nomen, and your cognomen. So take, for example, the character in my books, Marcus Flavius Geminus. There were only a select number of praenomen like Marcus, Gaius,
Sextus.
Julius, exactly. But then your nomen was the main clan you belonged to. But then you often got a nickname. Like, for example, Cicero means chickpea. And Naso, I think it's...
Oh, that's Ovid, isn't it?
Yeah, Naso is... Yeah, he's got a nose, and apparently Cicero's nose looked like a chickpea. But anyway, this guy called Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius claimed it, for he added it because he's got 3 already. Quintus, his praenomen, Caecilius, his nomen, and Metellus, his cognomen, his nickname. He added another cognomen nickname, Pius, after he recalled his father from exile. So he's patting himself on the back, and he has a coin. He issued a coin with a little stork on it. And apparently a stork is a symbol of pietas because the Romans believed that the stork returned to its nest every year and that it looked after its parents in old age, which is sweet. But the earliest coin we have, which is quite fun to show pietas personified, was a silver denarius issued by a guy called Marcus Herennius in 108 BC. And pietas appears as a beautiful woman in profile on the obverse. And then on the reverse, there's a little symbol of pietas, which shows a grown naked guy carrying his father on his shoulders. Or maybe his mother. And it's not Aeneas, but it's referring to this wonderful story of two Sicilian brothers who lived in Catana, which is modern Catania, right on the coast at the foot of Mount Etna. And one day, Mount Etna, this was, I think this was like the 4th or 5th century BC, this story. Mount Etna started to erupt and lava started to flow down towards Catania, and everybody else was grabbing their treasure. But the two brothers each took an aged parent on their shoulders. And when the lava caught up to them, a miracle occurred. It separated because of their pietas. And so they were able to go safely through without burning their feet. So,
Never heard that story.
isn't that? I'd never heard it either. And I thought, this is interesting, this concept of holding your parent, literally holding them on your shoulders. So that's a symbol of pietas, isn't it? A nice devotion to your parents, especially, I think.
So, this is all lovely, but it still feels a little bit boring, doesn't it? A bit worthy for our sense of Aeneas. I mean, he's just not, it depends what floats your boat, I suppose, but he's not a sexy, hot-blooded kind of killing machine like Achilles, is he? Or a cheeky con man like Odysseus. I think, in a way, it's just more that it's interesting because it's an unusual hero for Virgil to pick to be his protagonist. The scholar M. Owen Lee said that Homer's heroes are given epithets to describe their physical or their intellectual achievements, whereas Aeneas is characterized by a moral quality, and I suppose that is the real difference, isn't it?
Yeah, and for some reason we think moral is boring, but it's not. It's good. And I think you see that maybe Aeneas is a little bit, despite what Owen Lee says, who I'm like a huge fan of, I think Aeneas does show qualities of being hot-blooded and sexy at times, and also of duplicitous, perhaps, as we
Well, indeed, yes.
So, but you're right, it's kind of boring to be good. And that's why, like in the movie, The Prince of Thieves, remember Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves? Alan Rickman, Sheriff of Nottingham, was everyone's favorite character.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
like Han Solo in Star Wars is so much more exciting than Luke Skywalker. And I used to watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Spike, the evil vampire, was far more appealing than any of Buffy's other boyfriends.
Yeah, you don't hear of people getting the hots for Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. For sure. I think there's definitely something to be said there for the person that isn't the pious moral hero. But is Aeneas himself proud of it? Do you think he's aware of his piety and he's really wanting to highlight himself and that's hugely important to himself and his character? Or is it more that it's kind of put upon him by Virgil as the narrator? Because I think in book 5, Aeneas is called Pius Aeneas when he's praying to Jupiter to save the burning ships. And that makes sense. He's literally doing a religious act. He's a leader asking for help from the gods for a problem that wasn't his doing. It wasn't his fault. So that makes sense. But do you think, would he call himself Pius Aeneas?
Well, he does. I'm so glad you asked me that, because in the first book, Aeneid 1, 378, he introduces himself as Pius Aeneas. And here's what he says. Sum Pius Aeneas raptos qui ex hoste penates classe veho mecum fama super aetera notus, which means I am Pius Aeneas, or Pius Aeneas, who snatched my household gods from the enemy and carry them with me with my fleet. I am super famous. Actually, I've cheated a bit with that last translation. The phrase literally means by reputation above the heavens I am known, but there's that word super in there, so I'm super famous. I'm pious. So yeah,
that's quite a claim, isn't it? Can you imagine rocking up and going, I'm super famous?
Yeah, and because I'm so good and pious, I'm famous.
Yeah, I can think of plenty of philosophers who might argue that the more you go on about it yourself, the less morally good you are. And, that's definitely, pride is not a part of that.
Yeah, yeah. So does it make him seem a bit smug and conceited? Well, if you think so, you're not alone. There have been plenty of Aeneas haters over the centuries, and I was shocked, Katrina, to discover that, for
Oh dear.
example, Ezra Pound called Aeneas a stick, and Robert Graves, the author of I, Claudius, branded him a cad to the last.
Oh dear.
There's this brilliant high school teacher called Eric Robinson in Texas who teaches Latin, and he writes a great blog called Sententia Antiqui. And he suggests that Aeneas is the biggest chump in all ancient literature.
I mean, I do hear this a lot. I think when I say that we're doing a podcast about Aeneas and the Aeneid, or indeed that I would argue that it's up there with Homer, then you definitely get a lot of people shutting you down. And on one level, that's more of maybe a literary comment, but a lot of it is about Aeneas being a bit wet.
Yeah.
Aeneas just isn't the coolest of heroes.
Yeah, and they always think, oh, Aeneas, well, he was the one who was horrid to Dido, and stuff. They don't give him a chance. But I have to say, there are other poets and writers, some great ones, who love Aeneas, or Virgil's treatment of him at any rate. And St. Augustine loved the Aeneid, and he famously wept when he read Book 4 about Dido. And Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a whole ode to Virgil, which you can read on the internet. It's beautiful. In one stanza, he addresses Virgil. He says, "Thou that seest universal nature moved by universal mind, thou majestic in thy sadness at the doubtful doom of humankind." And this book I love by Owen Lee called Fathers and Sons in Virgil's Aeneid takes a positive view too. He says Aeneas is uncommonly tender and affectionate, but he's also careful to stress that pietas has nothing to do with emotional display and everything to do with clarity of vision and sense of purpose. And he goes on to really beautifully illustrate the three aspects of pietas. And he says that three authors who preceded Virgil helped solidify this: Catullus, Lucretius, and Cicero. And I'll just quote Cicero in De Natura Deorum. Cicero says, "Pietas justitia adversus Deos." Piety is acting justly toward the gods. There's our first use. In Pro Plancio, he says, "Quid est pietas nisi volunta grata in parentes." What is piety if not willing kindness to parents? There's our second use of it. And then in De Republica, Cicero writes, "Pietatum, quae cum sit magna in parentibus e propinquissima est." If piety is great when shown to parents and family, then it is greatest, maxima est, when shown to one's country, in patria.
So we can give some direct examples of these three types then, can't we, in the Aeneid? So book 2, we've got Aeneas describing lifting his father onto his shoulders. And he says the task will not weigh me down, even though he literally and figuratively is weighed down, and he's carrying his past into the future, and he brings those penates, the household gods, with him. So that's definitely showing piety to the gods and to his family. In book 4 then, which we touched on a couple of weeks ago, when he says he's got to leave Dido because he's got to follow his duty, not of my own accord, to try and get himself out of it, shows some admittance that the burden of pietas is great. It's greater than I don't know if we can say it's greater than the love he feels for Dido, but it's certainly going to sway him. He won't be able to make a different decision other than the one that comes from duty. So essentially, in that sense, he's putting his country before himself, the country that he hasn't yet reached, before himself and before others. So I think that's what we might call piety as a type of submission, and indeed suppression. He's suppressing his other emotions, he's submitting to the duty and the road in front of him. And then we've come to book 6, and then we have Anchises, his father, in the underworld, his speech for Rome's future. And that's the one that suggests that pietas is both a moral and a civil mission. Because in the quote you mentioned there with Cicero as well about showing piety, it's not just the act of doing something the gods say they like, it's doing it correctly, isn't it? It's doing it rightly. And in this case, to do with ruling, it's to do with ruling justly. So there's quite a few different complementary moral and ethic codes surrounding piety, isn't it? It has many different aspects that all sort of coalesce to be this ideal of behaviour. And the gods have laid out these clear rules around what Pius means. But going back to that point of it's not just to do with emotion, Aeneas is a lovely guy, but it's to do with clarity of vision and purpose. There do seem times when his own vision is a bit squiffy and he needs to go to Specsavers or have a lot of guidance to be put right back on his piety track, do you not think?
Yeah. But he is pious a lot. And when I was doing my little retelling of Virgil's Aeneid from the point of view of a dog, I noticed how every time he makes landfall, he sacrifices, and this is piety to the gods. And we kind of just skip by it. But, it involves getting an animal, cutting its throat, chopping it up, putting it on the fire. And of course, it results in a nice feast for everybody because you don't just leave the meat, you eat it. So yeah, he gets a bit squiffy at times, but he's trying so hard. And again, it's about self-denial often. You've got to put other people first, and we're not so good at doing that in the 20th.
I know, we might like to think we would be pious and able to do these things he's doing, but I think we'd find it increasingly difficult.
Yeah, and I have a little quiz question for you. This book that I've got I'm going to do a shout out to the Institute of Classical Studies Library in Senate House. This book actually used to belong to Paul Jackson, who is one of the librarians there, and he donated it. You can see that in the
he's
front.
wonderful.
It says the gift of Paul Jackson there. On the front, the subtitle, Fathers and Sons in Virgil's Aeneid, is Tum Genitor Natum. Tum Genitor Natum. And I just wonder if any of you Virgil experts out there know which Tum Genitor Natum means then the father to the son, understood, said de blah. Which father is speaking to which son? That's a little quiz, and it's quite a hard one. Do you happen to know, Katrina?
We'll leave a pause and then you can tell us the answer, Caroline.
Okay, we're leaving a pause. Stop the podcast. Ask your friends. Ask your teacher. Well, the answer is a surprising one. It's Jupiter speaking to Heracles, the ultimate pater, speaking to his son, Heracles. And Heracles is this beautiful young man named Pallas has prayed to Heracles, and he's a devoted follower of Heracles, and he's prayed, this is my first battle. Please, help me kill lots of people and survive. And he's not destined to. And Heracles is just torn up about it. And Zeus comforts him. And he said, even I had to lose my son Sarpedon. I loved him. There's sometimes we just can't help it. So that's quite sad, isn't it?
Yeah, and we have that really powerful section of the Iliad with the death of Sarpedon, don't we? And so many Vars he's depicted as being carried away by sleep and death, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, and he's big. He's a big hero like Aeneas. So, and Pallas is this beautiful young man who is not Aeneas's son, or is he his lover? But they're very close. They're very, very close, aren't they?
Yeah, these very close bonds. I mean, some people have likened it to Achilles and Patroclus. Perhaps not so in this case, but I think the level of Aeneas's furor, his fury, could still be sparked if Pallas was like a son to him rather than a lover.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking that although Virgil uses that mood, I think he's more obsessed with the father-son relationship than the lover relationship. And it does fit beautifully with the theme of fathers and sons that runs throughout the whole poem. And of course, you mentioned this image of carrying. We both talked about the image of carrying the father on the back, which goes back to one of the oldest ones, is from the 6th century BC. A beautiful black figure pot made in Athens, but found in Italy. So that's really exciting. And there's also this thing called tabula iliaca capitolina. It's a kind of marble slab with almost like a comic book or a graphic novel, which might illustrate the lost epic about the fall of Troy called the Iliupersis. And it shows Aeneas with Anchises on his shoulder, holding Ascanius by the hand. And interestingly, Hermes is his guide, Hermes, the messenger god. And we saw the coin, etc. So yeah, there's Pius Aeneas. And some poets and writers and scholars have even called Aeneas a kind of proto-Christian hero because they say his goal is not personal glory like Achilles for a glory and Cleos or Odysseus to get back to his wife and kingdom, but his goal is to help others find their destined home and look after them. And T.S. Eliot the American poet who became a British subject, wrote that there is in Aeneas a virtue, an essential ingredient in his piety, which is an analog and foreshadow of Christian humility. And Dante is perhaps the greatest believer of Virgil as a proto-Christian. He made Virgil his guide to the afterlife in the Divine Comedy. Now, you might have noticed my sleight of hand there. It's not Aeneas who's Dante's guide, but Virgil. And yes, I acknowledge that many scholars equate Aeneas with Augustus. We're going to talk about that in a future podcast. But I actually think that Aeneas is more like Virgil. He's a kind of alter ego of Virgil. Now, obviously, one was this big, strong hero, and the other slightly nerdy writer called I think his nickname, Virgil's nickname, was the Virgin, because he never got married or had kids or anything. He was almost a celibate, maybe, I don't know. But I think that Virgil gave Aeneas many of his own strengths and flaws and dilemmas.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie Quinn is a writer, and she had this brilliant collection of essays on Virgil, and she said that the tragic hero of our poem, the Aeneid, is the poet. We're going back to when we really were bigging up Virgil, when, he's claiming that he's just as good as all his predecessors, if not better. But I think there could be some truth in this. And actually, we've quoted lots from the McGill and Wright translation. In the introduction to that translation, Emily Wilson, who we also know from translating the Odyssey and Iliad, notes that through dutiful Aeneas, Pius Aeneas, Virgil plumbs the pain caused by competing loyalties and responsibilities, and the dangerous heartbreaking gaps between private desire and public duty. And we keep talking about these personal passions, and whether that be amor and also furor, the kind of that fiery anger and rage, and his pietas and his desire to do what's right for God, for family, and for the future state. And we spoke last week in our Viscum episode about the Golden Bough, and how that this actually was almost depicted, these choices, these competing, vying pulls upon the heartstrings almost, are depicted by that Y-shaped bough of mistletoe, and then also by the black horse and the white horse pulling Plato's chariots of the soul. Aeneas is constantly being tossed and turned by the seas and by the gods' plans, but also by these conflicting emotions and senses of duty.
Yeah, I love the way Emily Wilson, the private desire and the public duty, that is the constant choice and conflict. And so Aeneas is trying so hard to be good. This is what I thought until recently. A seed of doubt was planted in my mind when I read another recent translation of the Aeneid by Shadi Barch, who's a professor of classics at the University of Chicago. And I think it came out in 2021, so quite recently. And in her introduction, she points out there's a pre-Virgilian tradition that Aeneas was a traitor.
Oh, an interesting choice of word.
Traitor. And he betrayed his home city for material gain. And of course, at the time of recording this podcast, the UK is enthralled by Celebrity Traitors, the reality TV show where contestants are secluded in a castle and they have to work together to accomplish tasks, while 3 are secretly chosen to be traitors and kill off the faithful. Now, I know you're a big fan, aren't you? You've been watching.
I do. I know it's one of those guilty pleasures, I think, of all seasons of Traitors, both UK and abroad. But it's very exciting they have this new celebrity version, not least because it's more excellent TV content, but it's just very interesting to see how those dynamics play out with people who are in the public eye and some of whom know each other, and the stakes are slightly different in the game from the usual versions. So beware at this point that there will be some spoilers ahead if you have not yet watched all of the most recent episodes. We're recording this a couple of episodes before the final, so we won't know everything. I'm sure when you're listening to this in the future, you will have the power of hindsight and knowledge over us. But yes, just a warning there as we proceed with our Aeneid comes to Celebrity Traitors turret. And one of the celebrities this season is actually the CA's vice president, Stephen Fry. So that's really cool.
Yay! And you know what? He's a classicist, And also their first task, they had a group task, was to burn an effigy of the Trojan horse.
I know.
So it's
I'm so happy.
Aeneid and the Virgil gets everywhere. He permeates our society. And Natalie Haynes, a few Sundays ago, wrote an op-ed for the Sunday Times comparing elements of the Traitors to Greek tragedy. So the Celebrity Traitors is infused with classical references. Now, this is the first one that my husband and I have watched. And like many other newbies, we are amazed at how people can metaphorically stab someone in the back with a completely straight face and only some initial sweatiness in the case of comedian Alan Carr.
What a great booking and what a great choice that was.
Oh,
He's
yeah, we'll
proved
come
to
back to
be
him in a
highly
minute.
entertaining.
But Shadi Barch, to go back to her theory, she gives some really compelling evidence that Aeneas was a traitor. And she says that this tradition goes back to the first book of the Roman Antiquities by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was a contemporary of Virgil, probably a little bit older, writing in Latin in Rome, in Latin, I believe. He drew on an older tradition by another guy called Menecrates of Xanthus, a 4th century BC historian, who tells a very different story of Aeneas. In his version, Aeneas was angry with Alexander, that's another word for Paris, the son of Priam, who started the whole Trojan War by choosing Venus and going off to get Helen of Troy. Paris apparently didn't honor Aeneas as he thought he should have been honored in the funeral games of Achilles. So Aeneas decided to ally himself with the Greeks in exchange for his life and the life of his father and some of the older non-combatant citizens of Troy. And another scholar, I was going down this wonderful rabbit hole, scholar called Giampero Scafoglio, in an article called The Betrayal of Aeneas, he points out a line in the Iliad, which is, again, you could skip over, but it shows Aeneas hanging back at the Battle of the Ships. And it's Iliad 14, 459. Why don't I'll read that because it's in meter, and it's something like Bainai epainean ton hystaten hauren homilu, esta tot aedgar priamo epemenidio, hunecar eslon he ontamet andrassi u tiekin. And it means something like, he found Aeneas at the back of the crowd, standing still, for he was still angry with godlike Priam because he did not honor him as being noble among the men. A little bit of a hissy fit sulking Aeneas there at the back of the crowd.
Yeah, and interesting with Priam there being, king of the Trojans, very much honoured by everybody else. So I wonder if what the context and actually what the context of the epic tradition there is around that, as to what sort of reasoning, if that's just characterising Aeneas or if it's more implying that there were other seeds of doubts amongst the Trojans.
Yeah, and we know that Homer was a kind of patchwork, don't we?
Yeah.
Different versions, maybe. And so maybe this slipped in from a version where Aeneas is more clearly a bad guy. I mean, there was one version apparently by a much later Christian writer called Don Tzetzes from the 12th century, who mentions that Aeneas was captured by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, but then released for some mysterious reason, possibly as gratitude for his betrayal. Now, back to Shadi Barch, she points out that there are a few anomalies in the text. For example, this is really interesting. When Aeneas tells his story to Dido, he skews the facts in a way which might make him seem more sympathetic. Do you remember back in our episode Kerwa about Dido, you told how soon after Aeneas makes landfall, Venus, Aeneas's mother, in disguise, she kind of fills him in on the fact where he is. And she talks about Dido. Remember that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she tells him that Dido is this Phoenician woman whose brother betrayed her and that husband went missing, and then she only realised that she was in danger when she saw her mutilated husband in a dream, and he warned her to flee and to found a new city in a different land from her own. Yeah, that's the story that kind of is presented to Aeneas at that point.
And interestingly, when he then tells his story to Dido in her court, he talks about how Troy was betrayed by this guy called Sinon, and adds the apparently random fact that he saw the dead and mutilated Hector in a dream, and that Hector warned him to flee and found a new city in a faraway land.
Of course.
And do you want to read the Latin there?
Yeah, sure. So this is book 2, line 270. So Insomni sece Antioculus maestissimus Hector, visus adesse mihi, lagosque effundere fletus, raptatus bigis ut quanda matere cruento, pulvere perque perdis trajectus lore mentis. In my dreams, behold, pitiful Hector before my eyes appears to me, weeping huge tears, dragged by the chariot as once before, black with bloody dust his swollen feet, pierced by thongs.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautifully read. And this has often puzzled commentators because, of course, Aeneas knew how
Yeah.
Hector died. And he even just saw the image on the Temple of Juno in Carthage before he tells this story. So everybody knows that. So, why? But maybe by having Hector warn him in a dream to flee, just like Sichaeus warned Dido to flee, Virgil shows Aeneas cleverly mirroring, almost, he doesn't know he knows the backstory. It's a kind of to give them more in common.
Yeah, and how they're presented with having all of this in common. There's similarly we talked about before of being kind of equal, like Apollo and Diana, and having equal, standing amongst their respective people, being leaders, having to forge a city out of nowhere and build something new. But then also he's trying to do it himself. That's so interesting. And maybe actually, therefore, there is more of Odysseus in him after all. He's not only storytelling in these two books, like we see in the Odyssey, but he's actually got his own way with words. He's a bit tricky.
Absolutely. And then Bartsch also points out this fascinating thing about Sinon, and he has a huge speech in book 2 of the Aeneid where he actually convinces the Trojans to bring the Trojan horse in. He's got this long, convoluted story. But apparently, according to Shadi Bartsch, there are earlier mentions of him, but he's only just mentioned as a warrior. Only Virgil, as far as we know, makes him this deceptive kind of betrayer plant. He seems to be an invention of Virgil's or of Aeneas's. And she says that both Sinon and Aeneas tell such good stories that they are embraced and welcomed. And a few pages later, she adds that Virgil's presentation of Aeneas as the noble hero reluctantly fleeing burning Troy is so seductive that everyone promptly forgot about the previous main tradition that Aeneas was a traitor, which had been the previous tradition. And she also remarks, this is really fascinating, that Aeneas has a lot of bling with him, a lot of goodies and gold and swords and clothing and carpets and stuff for someone who just managed to escape by the skin of his teeth with his father, his son, and the household gods.
It is a weird one. And in the Dido episode, we said how she's enthralled by his beauty and his booty, his spoils of war is what I'm referring to. And you think, yeah, how is this actually feasibly possible? Obviously, there's lots of bits where we have to suspend imagination when it comes to their journey from Troy and their food supplies and everything like that. But also this sense that he has carried these treasures with him. So we know that M.O. Lee, we've mentioned a few times, is a big Aeneas stan. So he's trying to redeem this pre-Virgilian tradition of Aeneas being let off. And he says that he fought so bravely against the Greeks that they told him he could go and he could take something with him. And he said, I'm going to choose my father. That's what I'm going to take. He's so pious. And they were impressed by that. So they said, he could take something else. So he said, I'll take the family gods. And then, this is now a quote from Owen Lee, overwhelmed by his piety, the Greeks restored all his possessions, equipped him with a ship, and sent him on his way. So that's one potential interpretation of how that all came about, driven essentially by his piety. But we've said that piety has to be about submitting yourself or being compassionate to others and not putting your own needs in the forefront. But is that actually a way of almost, pushing that so far that then people give you presents and they give you nice things and they treat you well? So who knows?
Yeah, and it's interesting that although Owen Lee mentions that tradition in his book, Virgil never probably knew, of course he knew that tradition too, but he doesn't even mention it because it might, in the way that Nick Muhammad confessed that he'd been a bit of a player, throw suspicion on him.
Exactly, and we know he was doing it for good intentions, but will it still come to bite him? I thought, on a side note, bizarre that the traitors didn't choose to murder Nick. They chose to murder Lucy as well, didn't they? And when they all met.
The three of them should have got together and got rid of Joe because he was the one who was onto them.
That's true. They should have tried to banish him at the round table, shouldn't they? It was time for Jonathan to go, though, wasn't it?
Yes, we don't want to mention the word hubris, do we? But he's apparently very good natured about it. Yeah. Anyway, so as you said, maybe Aeneas is a bit more like Odysseus than we first thought, and he's not an entirely reliable narrator. And what we forget is that books 2 and 3 are told by Aeneas, not by Virgil. And so perhaps he was a super famous traitor celebrity who only pretended to be a faithful, pious Aeneas.
Exactly. This could all have been a lie. We've been trying to redeem Aeneas for you, the listener, but actually, maybe he was a traitor all along. And of this year's cast of the traitors, who do you think has done best at telling those lies in whatever their purpose might be?
Well, it's interesting because I listened to the Rest is Entertainment podcast with Richard Osman and Marina Hyde, and she suggested a fascinating thing. She said that Alan Carr, she thinks he knows that this is to entertain people. And she thinks that he's realized they're all telling a story as fiction. Heroes are anti-heroes trying to get their goals. What he does, she says, is he's shown you a journey. Think of him going to pieces at the start. That feels quite a long way away now, she said. Like he's becoming, like Breaking Bad or something like that. And essentially what she's saying is that Alan Carr is going on a hero's journey. He's got an arc from innocent comedian to dastardly traitor. So he's doing the Hollywood hero's journey thing, which we want to see the hero change in some way. And we were talking before, does Aeneas have an arc? From secret traitor to maybe tortured savior. Maybe he started out as a traitor, but he's ennobled by his attempts to do what's right. Or maybe he starts out as a selfish Homeric hero with a personal goal, but as I think it was Stedman commented, already by book 2, he's become a moral Virgilian hero, struggling to do the best for his people. What do you think? Do you think Aeneas
No.
was
Well, Aeneas, he doesn't get recruited. It's as if he's had all these opportunities to be tempted over to the dark side, and he somehow manages to keep his blinkers on with Dido. Then at other instances on his journeys, and when he comes to Italy as well, he remembers the importance and the particularity of his mission. Alan is an interesting one though, and as I say, I love how well he's done in this series, and we'll have to see whether in our episode that will be tonight will be whether or not he can deliver yet again Murder in Plain Sight. He's definitely had the hardest jobs. I think it's really it's been really, really tough for him. So we'll see how he goes with that, and whether or not he can then survive a final banishment. But it's an interesting one of where, in a way, you can become a little bit not cocky, but when you become a little bit too confident because you have built that story, like you said. He's told that story of being the kind of the bumbling, amusing, hilarious one, but he's kept it secret, and he's managed to then really be wicked and dastardly. But then he let slip the other day. He kind of let his guard down when he forgot that he had a shield that would protect him from that night's murder.
They should have caught that.
Yeah, and they haven't really gone for it enough yet. Maybe tonight could be the night that they do really build up a case against him. But it's a reminder to everyone that ever does something traitorous or treacherous and that spins the tales like Odysseus does. It's a bit like when he's in with Polyphemus the Cyclops, isn't it? And he thinks he's being so clever as he tells him that, he gets out and escapes from the cave and then shouts back, "Utis, nobody, was the person that harmed you." But of course, Polyphemus's dad is Poseidon, so it comes back to bite when you feel the vengeance and the wrath of the gods.
So I'm so impressed. Natalie Haynes, way back in episode 1, she apparently did hashtag Team Celia Imrie. And I didn't realize we're supposed to choose a celebrity who we think will survive. So we haven't planned this, but do you want to go stick your neck out? And of course, when people hear this, they'll know if we're right or wrong, because this is coming out probably after the final.
Gosh, for who's going to be in the final, or who's going to
win? Who's going to win?
Make it to the end? I can still see a final 3 that could end up being, perhaps it could be Celia, it could be either Kate or Nick, and it could be Kat. And Celia will be convinced that it's not Kat, but Nick will think that it is Kat, and they might vote again, and then Celia will be very sad. So that means Cat goes, so the traitors have lost, and then Nick and Celia share the money.
Nice one. Very nice. I like Nick Muhammad, and everyone's been saying he's actually the real brains of all those people. He's so clever. And he did really well on the bridge, didn't he, as well?
He did, yes. And amazing with solving puzzles and other things. He's been so fast. I heard on the podcast as well with Richard and Marina, they made a really good point about how all the missions are tested and tried to see how long they take, and therefore to add in jeopardy and different bits. And that they'd obviously worked out with one of the missions, nobody could possibly do it in under a certain time. And between the combination of Nick and his speed and intelligence and Joe Marler and his strength and skills, and that they did it so quickly that the game was over very fast. That was really interesting to see people working as a team as well, using all of their different skills.
Absolutely fascinating.
I wonder how Aeneas and his men would have fared on similar challenges. I mean, we see them in the funeral games, don't we, in Book 5, that there's lots of the very accomplished athletes still amongst them. But maybe if they had a little bit more ingenuity and teamwork, they may have survived a little longer on their journey.
Yeah, maybe Aeneas should have been more of a team player instead of this kind of lone, tragic hero, you know? Anyway, I kind of fell in love with Aeneas a little bit. Lots of women, as we said before, are attracted to the bad boys like Achilles and Odysseus and Han Solo. But I've always loved and admired men who are moral with a strong sense of goodness. And, you know, as all writers know, as I certainly know, that when you write fiction, your characters are more like you than when you write an autobiography, because when you write an autobiography, you kind of dissemble and you hide yourself, but fiction reveals yourself. And so that's why I think Aeneas is a version of Virgil. And that's why I agree with Alfred Lord Tennyson, who concludes his ode to Virgil with these words: I salute thee, Mantovano, I that loved thee since my day began, wielder of the stateliest measure, ever molded by the lips of man. So I reject the idea that Aeneas is a traitor, that Virgil secretly made him a traitor. I'm sorry, I love Shadi Bart's clever idea, but I reject that. And I think that he really showed that Virgil showed that Aeneas really was trying to be Pius. And so should we, don't you think, Katrina?
We should all be faithfuls, and if we went on that programme, I'm sure neither of us would want to be a traitor. But I think, though, that when we think about whether Aeneas does develop as a character, is he just a goody Pius character? It's all on one kind of moral plane, and his quandaries are tough for himself, but, you know, he's not that exciting. I think Virgil is showing us that the real difference is not just how he's developed as a person, but how the gods' attitudes to him have changed according to the trials and tribulations that he's been through. Griffin has a great quote on this, and he says that the difference is that in Book 12, the gods are now on Aeneas' side, and he knows it. Whereas in Book 2, when in Troy they were against him, he didn't know it. So he's gained that understanding and awareness. It is like he does grow into his character, he grows into his mission, and as he gets ever nearer to accomplishing it, he obviously gets that confidence that he can achieve it and that the gods are with him. So he's certainly a pious hero because his piety in the end is rewarded by the gods.
I think we've seen that despite the machinations of the gods, we have the ultimate decision. It's up to us whether we give in to that or not. And so, I mean, we will talk about the stunning, shocking ending of the Aeneid. There's so much to talk about. And I think next week we're going to talk about the Aeneid as a work of propaganda, and also these amazing two theories that arose in the 20th century called the pessimists and the optimists, which I'd never heard of till I started digging deeper into the Aeneid, but it's absolutely fascinating. So I think our word for next week has got to be pater, father, which is linked to patria, fatherland, and therefore also to pietas. So it follows on really naturally from today's episode.
Exactly. And we'll cover Augustus and his importance in this a little bit more as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Please drop into the comments on YouTube your predictions, or indeed who you think the current cast are like compared to some characters from the Aeneid. As you say, Natalie Haynes has done some fantastic ones based on Homer and different figures from mythology. We'd love to hear your Aeneid crossovers. And we shall see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us on the Classics Podcast.